I'm Michael Green with California State Parks. I'm the Interpretive Program Manager of the historic downtown area. The thing I'd like to talk about today is what I'm most passionate about, and that is what was happening to Monterey during the Mexican period and what brought Monterey big changes as New Spain revolted against Spain and became Mexico. And this all happened about 1821. And we talk about history in terms of dates and places and names, but it's always great, I think, to think about what it was like here in Monterey, what their reaction to all these dates and places and names and the news that was coming from Spain, what it must have been like for the folks in Monterey. Today, I think we have a tendency to kind of romanticize what Monterey was all about. And we certainly see that reflected in the way these historic adobes have been restored and the beautiful gardens that surround them. But bear in mind, Monterey back in 1821, the beginning of the new country of Mexico, was a very different place than our imaginations might take us. I think of it as a very brutal, isolated place, certainly in contrast to what our life is like today. And it's reflected in the photographs that come 40 years later. You can see the people walking around Monterey. There is no paving, it's dirty, it's dusty. They're isolated, as I said, in a way that is hard for us to imagine today when we visit Monterey. Isolated thousands of miles from the nearest provisions. And partially what led up to the revolution was that Spain wasn't really doing a very good job of provisioning this very far away colony, this place called Alta, California. It was thousands of miles from the nearest provision, so ships coming in very, very rarely, and Spain was controlling all of the trade coming into Monterey Harbor, to the point where they were only allowing ships from lower Mexico or lower New Spain and from South America to come in and send in provisions. So not only were the people who were, the soldiers, for instance, who were stationed here, were feeling isolated, but they weren't getting their pay, they weren't getting very good provisioning, and there was probably a pretty sour mood about Spain that led up to this revolution. In fact, the Spanish soldiers that were here considered it much like somebody sent to Siberia in the USSR would have felt as kind of a punishment. So there was a strong feeling of independence from Spain that had already sprung up before the revolution even started. So in 1821, Mexico declares independence from Spain, and this huge colony, Spanish colony, now becomes a province, the northernmost province of a new country called Mexico. It's 600,000 square miles of territory. It's hard for us to imagine California having borders like that, but today's California borders were nothing like the borders of Alta, California, Mexico. If you think of almost everything west of the Rockies and south of the Oregon border, this huge territory was now Alta, California, and its capital was Monterey. So the provincial capital then becomes the center of trade and commerce and also a government center. And Mexico's policy was a complete reverse from what Spain had imposed. In fact, they decided to open up the port of Monterey to international trade, which was unheard of till that point. The town council, Ayuntamiento of Monterey, would often meet in a building that had been used to house incoming trade, the custom house. That was the main port of entry. So the custom house was kind of a multi-purpose building. It served as an office for a port of entry, but it also served as sort of town council chambers, which lends a lot of credence to the idea that the custom house was kind of the capital building of Alta California. And so the custom house was where all the ships had to offload their cargo for inspection so that it could be taxed. Now this tax revenue was a major source of income for Monterey. Monterey didn't have any manufacture of its own. It had some agriculture and certainly a lot of cattle left over from the Spanish mission period. And so they turned that cattle into currency. They turned these free-ranging cows into something they could make money off of. What they would do is a couple of times a year, they'd have a vast slaughter, and they would kill off all these cattle for their hides and tallow. Tallow used for candles, lubricants, soaps, and the hides used for leather goods. Leather for boots, saddles, chaps, things that pertain and relate to their main form of transportation. which was, horse and buggy and horseback. But more importantly, that leather that was used as currency here in Monterey was loaded on board ship and sent back to New England and Europe to be used to turn the wheels of industrial factories. It was California cowhides that turned the wheels of the Industrial Revolution. Richard Henry Dana, when he was here in the 1830s during the Mexican period, talked about how he thought it was kind of ironic that these cowhides that were used as currency, roughly worth $1 each, would be brought back to Boston to turned into boots that were later put on trading ships and sent right back to Mexico and purchased by the same men who had sold the leather in the first place. So once it was known that Mexico had opened its port, there were international companies interested. One of them was Hartnell. These were a British company that had decided that this was an opportunity that was heretofore unfounded. Hartnell had been trading along the Pacific Northwest into the Sandwich Islands, which are now called Hawaii, and then into the Orient, Canton, China. And Hartnell sees Monterey as the ideal stopping off point for trade. And they get almost an exclusive contract with the Mexican government to trade on the Pacific coast. Another New England company, Bryant and Sturgis, come in, and their agreement with the government in Mexico meant that they could trade along anywhere on the coast of California, whereas a lot of other ships had to come in, and they were only allowed to trade in either San Diego or Monterey or those two. But Bryant and Sturgis got a contract where they could go up and down the coast. Typically, they'd bring in the cargo, it was inspected, and then it was taxed. And this is something I like to say because it relates to what's going on in our economy today. This whole idea of taxation. How did Monterey make so much money? You might be surprised to know that they would charge about 100% of the value of the cargo. And you wonder what trading company would make such an agreement? How could they turn a profit? Well, you're buying a Mexican hide for $1, you're loading it into the hull of your ship and taking it back to New England for manufacture. That $1 hide is then sold in New England for $10, and then the goods brought back brought extra profit. So let's say if we believe Richard Henry Dana saying that he had 40,000 hides in the hold of his ship when he returned after 2 years of trading on the coast of California, that would mean a $400,000 cargo coming back to New England. So that's why they were willing to pay 100% tax. Another kind of vestige left over from the Mexican period, of course, are the cultural vestiges that came in. We're talking about the customs that were brought from Spain into Mexico and then ultimately Alta, California. And one of my favorite stories is about the bull and bear baiting. Now, earlier I mentioned hide and tallow trade and these huge slaughters of cows once or twice a year. Well, up until that point, cows were, they're kind of range cattle, long horns, thin bodies, used primarily for food. But once their hides became valuable, these huge slaughters took place, and they would often leave these carcasses in the fields. What would that do? Attract grizzly bears. And so once grizzly bears were coming into the ranchos, then they had to be disposed of. Now, grizzly bears are a very fierce animal, and 2, 3, 4, 5 vaqueros would grab ropes and bring one of these things into town. And a popular activity, kind of a leftover from the blood sport of Spain, was to stage grizzly bear fights with Mexican fighting bulls. And you could imagine that would be kind of a bloody contest. And they took place just adjacent to where the custom house was, which is kind of the town center. Right behind Pacific House was a popular place. And what was once a big corral there, that's where they would stage these fights, chaining the Mexican fighting bull to the fighting bear. And then people would wager on the outcome. It was a sport. Today, when we talk about the stock market, we talk about a bull market and a bear market. How did that come to be? Well, bulls attack from the bottom up and bears from the top down. So when it's a bull market, it's going up. When it's a bear market, the market's going down. So we have kind of an association there to modern lingo. Again, the transition from Spain to Mexico was cause for celebration here in Alta, California, especially because this became an international place of trade. But then there was yet another transition, a transition away from Mexico into the American period. And what brought that on was similar to what brought on the revolt against Spain. And that was, we were still, even though we were now linked internationally by trading ships, an isolated place. A ship, even during the height of trade during the Mexican period, a ship would come in twice a month. And during that time, when there wasn't a ship coming in, there wasn't a whole lot to do, and the custom house was sort of turned into a place where community groups, parties were held, fiestas, dances like fandango, which became popular during the Mexican period. So that Mexican culture was beginning to meld with the influences from Europe and New England, and that's where we get the fandango. This whole idea of a Mexican folk dance was very, very traditional, and it usually meant that men and women were adhering to very strict cultural rules about physical contact, for instance. But the fandango was an idea where that combined this very new dance from Europe called the waltz with Mexican folk dancing. So this meant that couples could actually, dare I say it, touch. Now, this was a huge barrier to overcome for a lot of the young men here in Monterey, because generally, you weren't allowed to even approach a young lady unless you had been properly introduced, and you had usually an older woman who was safeguarding the younger woman that you had to get around. But at these fandangos, it was almost as if all of these customs were relaxed and men and women could approach one another. So you can see that they were quite popular, and those did take place in the custom house. One of the things that we look at today when we see the custom house is this large adobe structure. It's really quite magnificent, and especially for its time, to have a two-story adobe structure with towers on either end and a very long storage facility, all made of adobe. But it didn't always start that way. During the Spanish period, we know that there was probably a little shack there right on the site that the custom house stands today. And that was probably used for the Spanish ships that came in from lower New Spain as a kind of provisioning storehouse. When Spain started needing a little more space, then we know that an adobe structure went up, probably right about where the north tower of the custom house is now. And then when Mexico opens the port to Spain, they're looking at a need. They're looking at plans for a much larger building. And so, because of this international trade coming in, the building was enlarged to the size we see today. And its particular size corresponds to the size of the average hold of a trading ship. So there'd be enough space to offload cargo. And offloading cargo, if you look at Custom House today, you stand there in front of it, you see, well, how in the world could they ever offload cargo in this place? There's today a very modern recreational trail that separates the Custom House from the shoreline. Well, that wasn't there. And if you walk into Custom House, you can see artist depictions of what it was like during the Mexican trading period, all the way up until the early 20th century, in fact. And this cargo literally had to be loaded into to longboats and then rowed ashore and beached near Custom House and then brought in and then assessed, loaded all back into the boats and back onto the ship so that whatever wasn't left in Monterey could be carried to other ports along Alta California. The one thing I think I want to impress more than anything else about this description of Mexico, this brand new country, is it was exactly that. It was a brand new country that was still trying to figure out how it fit in the world of international trade that had already been established by England and the United States on the trade routes to China. And it wasn't the romantic thing we think of when we say Monterey today. It was a lonely, isolated outpost. If you were a soldier here, it was rugged duty. If you were a citizen here, something as plain and ordinary to us like a bar of soap was a special thing, or a tool or a wagon wheel that was coming from a faraway place. These were exotic imports to them. So life in Monterey was pretty hard in the Mexican period.